Hi everyone, welcome to THT, and today we're going to go through 7 steps to build better decks. So this is a guide meant to help people who love to build their own deck, how to become better at it, how to have more competitive decks so you spend your effort in the right direction and create more powerful and more competitive decks. So, as you know, the Shadow of the Galaxy is going to come out in July, and with that is gonna many new cards are going to be revealed along the way, even before the release, and the card pool is almost going to double, which is going to create a lot of great opportunity to create new decks. And if you want to make decks that are actually powerful, this guide is going to be super helpful at taking advantage of all those new opportunities. Obviously, it is still very much possible to build new powerful decks even right now, even though the meta is a little bit more figured out. Um, but obviously, it's going to be a lot easier to do that when we get new cards, because obviously now a lot of stuff are already being figured out quite a bit. So moving on to my first step, and the first step is to do your homework by copying, which may be a little bit counterintuitive for some of you guys, but the first step in learning how to build good decks is to copy the other decks, is to basically what I call net decking. I made entire videos about it on why is net decking um, not only a thing that should not be condemned, but also something that should be encouraged to some extent, is because it is part of the learning process. It's part of the process of learning how to build your own decks. So, and this for multiple reasons. So first of all, you have to familiarize yourself with the constructed gameplay. You have to familiarize to know what a constructed deck looks like in Star Wars Limited and how powerful it is. If you've never played Star Wars Limited before and you build your own decks, it's very likely that this deck is not going to be very powerful. I would even go as far as saying that even if you have a significant experience in playing Star Wars Unlimited, if you've never played with or against a meta deck, you are not going to build a very strong deck. Or at best, you're going to just reinvent the wheel, which is not particularly helpful in our goal to try to build better decks. So the first step is familiarize yourself with the meta, know what exists, so you can build something truly different. Um, so another argument is that you cannot build a strong deck if you don't even know what a strong deck is. It's like the same as a movie director. If you're a movie director, if you've never watched any movies before, there's no way you're going to be building that you're going to be making good movies. That is just impossible. The part of the craftsmanship and part of what's going to make you a good at producing something is to know what is the standard of quality, what is the standard of power that you need to reach to get to your goals. And obviously the main indicator that your deck is strong is your ability to defeat the meta decks. And the best way to do this is to simply play them yourself. So learning the metagame so you can counter it. So obviously not only by playing powerful decks, you actually understand what a strong deck is, but also allows you to learn the weaknesses of that deck so you can counter them as well. Because being able to counter those decks is going to be the indicator that your deck is mature and able to be shown to the world. So that's the first step of any step. Familiarize yourself with the meta, play meta deck, play against and also play with meta decks, meaning decks that we've been showing on this channel, decks that are performing in tournaments and stuff like this. The second step is to get an idea. Obviously, the starting point of building your own deck is to think about something that has never been done and capitalize on it to build a deck around it. So, first, the different starting point for a deck can be a powerful card or a leader that has untapped potential. So, it's what I call the good stuff approach. So, playing very powerful cards. So this approach is relatively difficult to innovate on because most of the time it is relatively obvious for most people what are the powerful cards in the game, and therefore people have naturally built decks around them. With that being said, sometimes there are cards that get under-evaluated. There are cards that people underestimate. So building a deck around powerful cards that have not seen a lot of play, that simply just very powerful because they have very powerful stats, very powerful abilities that people underestimate. It is difficult to build new ideas, new innovative deck with this, but it is obviously a lot of decks are built around that approach. A good example, of course, the Boba Green deck is a typical good stuff deck. It's a deck that has some of the best cards in the game gathered in one deck. The next approach is the combo approach, powerful synergies that haven't been tried before. So the idea is that a synergy is you get two elements, and when those two cards are combined together, they produce an effect that is more powerful than the sum of their parts. That's what we call a synergy. So if you identify powerful synergies that maybe have never been used before, that could be another starting point for a deck. Maybe you can try to build a deck around those powerful synergies in order to get an advantage. And obviously, once you get the starting idea, then the deck kind of build itself around it. Another a good starting point for building a deck is to find a new strategy that is very well positioned in the meta. So what I mean by well positioned is that there are certain kind of decks or certain cards that are very powerful against other cards, and sometimes it's not so much about creating a powerful deck, but rather create a deck that specifically counters existing decks. This is what we call the metagame approach. So there are cards which may seem relatively weak at first sight, but once again, when they are put in the right situation, can become very powerful. A good example for this is for example, Steadfast Battalion. Steadfast Battalion in a vacuum is not very powerful, but what makes the card very powerful is that most of the powerful leaders in the game, whether it's Krennic, Boba, or even Luke, they come out with 7 HP, and if you and Steadfast Battalion being used with Energy Conversion Lab come into play as a 5/5, gets a +2/+2 bonus to get to 7 attack, is one of the only way in the game you can reliably deal 7 damage to a unit. I don't think Steadfast Battalion is very strong in a vacuum. It is very strong because of a certain for a certain context. There's a metagame context that makes this card strong. And another thing that makes this card strong is of course the combination with Energy Conversion Lab. Those two factors here are basically what makes the card strong. So there are cards that are strong by themselves, cards that are strong in combination with something else, and there are cards that are strong because they counter a specific meta. And it's the same for a deck. If your deck has powerful cards, powerful synergies, and also counters the meta, that is the recipe for a very powerful deck. And those are excellent starting points to start building your deck. Another thing that I want to say as well is, if you really want to create something really new and really innovative, often you have to think outside of the box. You have to be open-minded and get ready to unlearn what you think you know. A good example for this is, for example, play cards that are out of aspect. You may think that it is common knowledge that playing cards that are out of aspect in constructed is a bad idea. It's simply just not gonna. It's a bad idea. It's simply just gonna. You're just gonna be playing 2 more for a card is never worth it. But if you are trying to build a deck and build something innovative, maybe you need to take a second look at this and try to identify maybe areas in which it could be possible that an out of aspect card could be very powerful. And that's usually how you create new and innovative strategies, by simply keep an open mind and be ready to unlearn some of the things that you think you know. The second big step is to get a plan. A plan is essential if you want to build a strong deck. You can have a lot of very powerful cards in your deck, very powerful synergies, or very powerful counters to the meta, but the overall deck needs to have a goal, and all the cards needs to be pointing out throughout the same direction, to the same direction. And so I'm just going to reduce my screen a little bit here. Yep. And basically the way you do this, so here's the different game plan that exists in the game. So there's three main game plans in the trading card game. It's always aggro, control, and combo. So aggro is trying to kill the opponents as quickly as possible, playing units, attacking with those units, and maybe try to deal damage, direct damage to the base, and try to kill the base as quickly as possible. It is the most natural way to be playing a trading card game. It is the aggressive game plan. The control game plan is the opposite. It's about being defensive, being reactive rather than proactive, answering the threats, and making the game go longer and delaying the end of the game so that you can reach a position where you can get the advantage by playing very powerful late game cards, what we call inevitability tools, so tools that allow you to win the game inevitably as it reaches a certain point. That's what a control strategy is about. And then there's the combo approach, which is basically trying to combine a combination of cards that will win you the game. So those are win conditions. They are your game plan. This is the plan that you are trying to follow to win the game. And then of course there's everything in between. There's the aggro control called the tempo decks, which are being aggressive but still have a few elements that allows you to control the opponent, so you can so they are basically a little bit more interactive than aggro decks, but they're still fairly aggro. And then there's the control aggro deck, also called the mid-range decks, which are as much of aggro as they are mid-range, and they are kind of on both level at the same time, and they can choose which option they want to do depending on the situation. So usually speaking, mid-range decks are going to have a weaker game plan because they are split between two different game plans, which is normally not a good thing, but generally speaking, mid-range deck compensate that weaker game plan by stronger cards. And then of course there is everything in between aggro and combo and control. I'm not going to go into too much detail about those, simply because those are game plans that are right now there's no real combo decks in Star Wars Unlimited. Combo decks as a win condition. There's not really any of that in Star Wars Unlimited right now. It might be the case in the future. It's most likely will be the case in the future, but right now there's not really any combo deck. So most of the decks that you're going to see in Star Wars Unlimited are going to be involving around aggro, control, and everything in between. So these are the different game plans, and basically having a game plan is very important because it means that every card that is going to compose your deck is going to be pulling in the same direction, and this is very powerful. You can play a deck with relatively weak card, but if every card perfectly serves the same purpose that your deck is trying to achieve, it's going to make your deck a lot stronger. The next step is obviously the most obvious one, is to choose your cards well. So what are the criteria that we use to choose the cards? Well, there's different ones. So first of all, the first question you kind of need to answer is, does that card help me accomplishing my plan? So we already defined the plans, the aggro, control, mid-range, tempo, combo, or whatever. And then you have to ask yourself the question, does that card allows me and helps me in what I'm trying to achieve in this deck? And if the answer is yes, then it's a card that is probably a good idea for your deck. I also have to say that in terms of game plan, we talked about the concept of aggro control, and it can be that's obviously a plan, but it also can be something a bit more specific than that. A plan can be something that is a little bit more specific than that. So for example, so that's something to keep in mind. Another one is this card a good card? Obviously there are cards that are stronger than others. We already talked about the good stuff approach, is like simply just combining a lot of very powerful cards together, and they might not combo with each other, but because they're all very strong cards, it's going to make a strong deck. So for this, there's not really any magic recipe. It's mostly experience and learning the game that's going to tell you what cards are good. I've actually made a tier list where I ranked every single card in the game. So obviously you can just take a look at this, and that will tell you kind of what cards are strong, what cards are not, and that's going to be very helpful for you to build your deck. Even though I made this list about almost 1.5 months ago, I still think that 99% of what I say in this tier list is still accurate today, so don't be afraid to go back to it. The next point is this card well positioned in the meta? So this is something that is very important, is that a card is not really good or bad in a vacuum. It is good or bad depending on a certain environment and certain things. So for example, technically speaking, a 3-2 is not better than a 2-3. It really depends on the environment. If you are in an environment where there's a lot of 2-1s or 2-2s roaming around, then 2-3s is a lot better than being a 3-2. If you're in an environment where there's a lot of 3-3s, 4-3s, 4-3s or stuff like this, then 3-2 becomes a lot better. So you see, like, it's all a matter of context, and this is where it is particularly important to study the meta and to study what the strong decks are, so then you can know if a card is well positioned. Some card may seem very weak at first sight, but depending on the meta can become very powerful. Once again, Steadfast Battalion is a good example for this. Most leaders in the game that see play have 7 health, which make Battalion very strong. And that also obviously means that the card is very well positioned in the meta. The next point is, does this card have a synergy with other cards and leaders? That is obviously a very important point. Sometimes cards, once again, can be relatively weak in a vacuum, but in combination with something else be very powerful. A good example for this is Fourth Throw. Fourth Throw, yeah, pay 1, discard a card, not very good. If you get a force unit, the card becomes a lot more powerful. So in the case of Fourth Throw, it's relatively obvious because it's literally written on the card that you need another force unit to enable the additional effect. But sometimes it's a lot less obvious. Sometimes the synergies are more hidden. They're more, and this is usually where, like, for example, the combination between well, I don't have an example on top of my head, sorry, but you get the idea. Some synergies are hidden and a bit less obvious, and those synergies are usually the one that you're going to be able to capitalize on because they are more difficult to figure out. And the last question you can ask yourself whenever you're putting a card in your deck is, does this card compensate one of my weaknesses? So this requires a higher degree of knowledge of your own deck, and this is probably something you're going to figure out only when you start playing your deck. You're going to understand, you're going to grow a better understanding of the deck. What is it strong against? What is it weak against? And then from there, you can add cards that can compensate your weakness of your deck. Some card that, for example, normally you would put them in the sideboard, maybe you want to put them in the main deck. A card that, for example, in my hand deck, Traitorous is not a card that may seem very strong because I'm mostly trying to abuse U-Wing reinforcements, so I want to capitalize on the amount of units I have in. I want to capitalize on the amount of units that I have, and Traitorous does not really help with this, but it does counter one of it's a very good card against Boba Fett, and Boba Fett is one of my worst matchups. So this is a good reason for me to play Traitorous. That's just an example, of course. If a card does not answer any of those 5 questions positively, it probably needs to be cut. Next point is balance your deck. So once you've done the work of choosing your cards and having a plan, you still need to have a balanced deck if you want your deck to flow properly. And the way we balance deck is by looking at the curve of a deck. So the idea of having a deck that flows well is to have a deck where you have something to play every turn. You need to have optimize your resource spending, so then you are utilizing your resource every turn. You have something powerful to do every turn. And for this, we have the curve. The curve is basically we lay out all the cards in our deck, and we look at the cost of those cards, and we look at what is the curve of the different cards. So I'm going to give you an example here. So here, for example, this is a good example of a low curve. So we see most of the cards in the deck cost 3, 2, and 1. This is, for example, the curve for an aggro deck like Sabine, and a few 4, 5s, and 6. So ideally, a curve should have priority on the 2 drops. So there's different version of the deck. So But the idea is that you're going to be looking at this, and this is going to give you information about how well your deck is going to flow. So I've already talked about this, by the way, in my videos about drafting. So one drops are usually a lesser priority because in Star Wars Unlimited you start with 2 resources, though the most important is to have a turn 1 play based on having 2 drops. And then 3 drops are also very important because on turn 2 comes you're only going to have 1 draw step to get into a 3 drop, and you need to have something to play right after turn 2. Turn 4 are less important because once again you got multiple draw steps to find a 4 drop, and also you can also optimize your resources simply by playing 2 drops instead of playing a 4 drop, or playing a 3 drop with a 1 drop, for example. 5 drops you can simply play even less important because you can play 3 drops and a 2 drops, and 6 drop you can simply play 2 3 drops. And then this deck doesn't have anything that has 7 drops, so it's probably not going to resource beyond 7. So that's a good example here of an aggro curve that is very low. Usually I like to have more 2 drops than I have 3 drops, but once again, the curve is not the only factor. There's also other factors that justify you playing some cards over others. But curve is a very important one to take a look to know, to make sure that your deck is going to be flowing properly. So here's an example for an aggro curve. Let me now give you an example of a more control curve. So this is a good example of a control curve. As you can see, we have a lot of 2 drops and 3 drops because that's what we want. Because we want to be able to consistently be able to play early on. But then we have a significantly more 4 drops, 5 drops, 6 drops, 7, and even go up to 8 drops to play more expensive things. And we don't really need 1 drops. Once again, depends on the deck, I guess. But this is a good example here of a control curve. Just something to bear in mind there is that the program I use basically takes into account all the cards. So Star Wars Unlimited DB takes into account every single card in your deck. If you really want to do this in a very precise manner, you have to exclude cards that are not really meant to be played on curve. So typically removal or situational cards are not really here to be on the curve. Usually what you want to put on the curve is cards that you really want to play on curve. So I'm just going to move my so you can see the curve here. So yeah, so what I'm trying to say is that there are certain cards that are not really meant to be played on curve, so exclude them so you can see what your curve looks like without those cards, because those cards are not really meant to be played on curve. For example, Power of the Dark Side, yes, it is technically something you can play on turn 2, but more often than not, it's something that you can be playing depending on the situation. While, for example, an Echo-based Defender is a real 3 drop because it's really something you want to play on turn 2, ideally. Moving on, we got a good number here for the amount of 2 drops, so it's very important. 2 drops are the most important in Star Wars Unlimited, and it is usually advised to have between 9 and 15 turn 1 play in a game. So between 9 and 15 cards that you're really happy to play on turn 1, because you only have your starting hands to find those 2 drops, so you need to have a lot of them. And they're also cards that, once again, if you're on turn 3, you can play 2 drops, so they're relatively flexible. And not missing your turn 1 play is not always, but often an important thing to do whenever you're playing the game. So between 9 and 15 turn 1 play is kind of the number that gives you good odds in general, and it's a good number to keep in mind while you're building your deck. Obviously, if you're playing an aggro deck, you're going to need more 2 drops because you're going to be wanting to have a more consistent low curve, while the control decks can get away with playing less. The next step, of course, of your journey into making a good deck is to playtest, playtest, and playtest. So obviously there's no secret. In order to discover things that haven't been discovered, you need to get into certain territories that other people have not been to. And for this, the only way to do that is to playtest. And here I'm going to give you a few tips on what I mean by playtesting. So playtesting, of course, playing against other players in order to put your deck to the test and see if your ideas work in practice. The first tip I'm going to give you for effective playtest is to playtest against meta decks. If you're telling me that your deck has a very good matchup against Era Syndulla, it doesn't really say much of your deck. It doesn't mean that your deck is very good, because it turns out those decks are not very good. So you need to test against very powerful decks, because this is what's going to put your deck to the test, and that's how you're going to realize how powerful your deck is. So this one is relatively obvious. Next, you need to find decks that are piloted by good players. So if you're playing against Boba Green, but the Boba Green is piloted by someone who's discovered the game yesterday and doesn't know the game very well, well, once again, your playtest is not going to be very high quality, because obviously that player is going to make a lot of mistakes. That's not going to give you a representative idea on what your deck is worth. So try to pilot against as good players. So not everybody has access to playtesting against very good players, but try to identify around you people that you think are good at the game and playtest your deck against them to put your deck to the test. Of course, it goes both ways. If they're playtesting their decks, if they are willing to playtest against you and help you build your deck, you should also be willing to do the same for them when the time comes. So that is something that I think is quite important. Also, a mention for people who are playtesting their deck on fail table, on force table. This is playtest on force table is almost worthless, because the AI is simply not good enough. The AI is simply not good enough. I think like force table is great to discover the game. It's great to have like an initial feeling about the deck, like for example to test your curve, see if your curve is nice and fluid, if the deck flows well. But beyond this, the AI is simply not good enough to put really up a good challenge, and it's not going to give you a quality playtest. So playtesting on fail table is effectively worthless. Reach a certain point. Another tip that I give is to allow takebacks. So takebacks, the idea of like if someone makes a wrong play and want to take back the play he made in order to make a different one. To some extent, you should allow mistakes. You should allow people to take back their misplays, because whenever you're playtesting, you're trying to play against the best possible opponent. And if you do not, and also people obviously when they playtest, they're not as focused as when they play in tournaments, so they might make a few careless misplay, or like they might be as focused. So you want to, as much as possible, you want to let them take back their mistakes, because you want to be playing. Your goal is not to win. Your goal is to put your deck to the test and fight and play against the most competent opponent possible. Then, of course, between every game, you need to make, not every game, but at least every best of 5 or every handful of games, it's a good idea to make adjustments and keep going at it until you have a stable version of the deck. So if you want to have the question, the answer of when is it time to stop playtesting, well, it's time to stop playtesting when you stop making adjustment to your deck. If you keep playing and you keep making adjustments and so on, then that means you probably need to keep playing and keep playtesting the deck. Once you start having a very good idea what the deck is capable of, and you're not willing to make any more changes, this is probably the time where you know that your deck has reached the maturity, and you have the answer to your question of whether it's a good deck or a bad deck at this point. Point number 7 and final point is to know your strengths and weaknesses. So the first thing that is important is to not be delusional about your deck. So a lot of people get very emotionally attached to their deck because it's their baby, they've been working on it for so long. So there's an emotional attachment that comes to this. And it's very good, because it's what makes deck building so fun, is this idea that you are nurturing that baby, that you are making a deck that is your own, that you've worked on it for so long. And but sometimes it can be very easy to get lost in that. It can be very easy to simply lose sight of your primary objective, which is to have the best deck possible, and just get married to your deck. And this is obviously not a good thing if you are looking to be a competitive player, because you are obviously blind to the weaknesses of your deck. you need to be able to be very aware about what your deck is good at. And this is something that I see a lot of people falling into, especially people who don't have a lot of experience in TCGs. They start building their own deck. They have this kind of honeymoon period where they're like, this deck is the best, it's an and then you have like those wild statements where, oh, I built this deck that is it is probably the best deck in the game, and they have those super hot takes, right? And 9 times out of 10, those hot takes are just inaccurate. They're just people who are just too emotionally invested in their deck, and they are not judging their deck objectively. They have and as soon as their deck is really put to the test, you realize that that the deck is simply just not that good. So set your emotion aside, and it's very important to understand what are the weaknesses and the strengths of your deck. So, and the reason for this is like, if you know the strengths and weaknesses, you will know when it is favorable environment for your deck to perform. So if you are aware of, so a good example for this is Vader, right? So Vader Green has been one of the first deck I've really started to put a lot of time into and play the deck a lot. And I had a lot of good success with the deck, but the entire time I knew what were the weaknesses of the deck. I knew that the deck was very weak to aggro. And this was very useful to me because when aggro deck started to emerge in Star Wars Unlimited, so basically around November, December, when you really started to see a lot of aggro decks emerging, when new aggro card really started becoming very powerful, I knew it was time for me to stop playing this deck and to play something else instead. And so knowing my strengths and weaknesses allowed me to choose my deck properly. And I know that if ever aggro start to become a lot less played, I know that I will be able to take a second look at my Vader deck, get it out, and know that it will be able to perform very well in that environment. So it's not always about building the best deck, it's also knowing when to play it, and and knowing when it is time to pull this deck out of the closet and perform with it. If you know the strengths and weaknesses of your deck, if you know what your deck is missing, that means that you're going to be, whenever the tools that your deck needs comes around, you will know what you need to compensate those weaknesses. So sometimes, as I said earlier, sometimes the tool that you need to compensate the weakness of your deck exists already, and that's perfect. But most of the time, and sometimes they don't. But at least you know that. So when there's going to be new cards being released, so most probably Shadow of the Galaxy comes about, you will know, and you see a card, you say, oh, this card is exactly what I need to make my deck good. And suddenly you are on the pole position to be the player who is going to be bringing that new deck to the table and perform with it. So it puts you in a good position to put that deck to the test, because you know that this specific tool is the pieces that you were missing for your deck to perform. So this is another important thing as well whenever you talk about knowing your deck and having a realistic view about your own deck, because this allows you to say, okay, I know what I need to compensate the weakness of my deck. Okay, so this is the end of this video. So this is a nice global overview of what is it to build a competitive deck for Star Wars Unlimited. So if I had to summarize, so first you need to acknowledge yourself with the metagame. You need to understand what the meta, what a strong deck looks like, what are the decks that you need to play around, what are the decks you need to counter. The second step is going to be to get an initial idea, an original idea. This is the most creative part of the deck building process. Then the next is going to be knowing what cards are strong, knowing what cards synergize with which, knowing the meta, and choosing the cards depending on those factors, and have a game plan to make sure that all those cards pull in the same direction. And then obviously a lot of playtest and have a lot of awareness of what your deck is capable of. And if you do all those things, you are far more likely to produce competitive decks and hopefully have more fun as well, because it is very fun to build your own decks, obviously, but when those decks actually pull up performances and actually are very competitive, this is one of the most satisfying things you can ever do in a card game. and I wish this to every person. I hope that every person, at least one in his life, once in their lives, will be able to experience the joy of building a deck and actually making significant performances with that deck. And whatever it might be, whether it's just about winning a local tournament, or whether it is just to beat that player that has been beating you for years, or whether you want to become the world championship. Like whatever your goals are, it is very satisfying to come about, build your own deck, and building. As much as I defend the idea of net decking, as much as I defend the idea of learning the meta by copying other decks, there's nothing. If you never build your own deck, if you've never produced your own deck, you're going to be missing out on a huge part of what playing a trading card game is about. Where this is really a fun experience that I wish that everybody will engage with at some point, if they have the time, of course. With all that being said, I hope this video was useful. If you like that kind of video, please comment and subscribe. See you next time.